Okay, hello to everyone and welcome to another one, probably the last one of our MC12 interview series on WTO MC12 and Beyond. Today, my name is Xiankun Lu. I'm the founder and CEO of Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG, which was established at the end of 2016, focusing on WTO reform and multilateralism and inclusive economic growth. And today, we are going to discuss something very important. What we say is collaboration among major players and also their leadership role, which makes MC12 a success. And for that, we are honored to have our FMG member and is also former Deputy USDR, Wendy Cutler, with us. So Wendy, thanks a lot for taking your time with us. I think the collaboration among the major players, especially between US and China, has been said by many as a highlight of the MC12 success. And our audience probably should have noticed that DG has made a few announcements at her Twitter. One of it, she did say that the US-China collaboration during MC12 is so important, which helps bring us through at the toughest moments. Wendy, you also have published shortly after MC12 an article titled "A Glimmer of Hope for Improved US-China Trade Relations," where you also talk about these two major players, their collaboration, and how that would mean for not only the bilateral relationship, but also for the work ahead for the WTO. So could you probably summarize a little bit what you think with that article and could we learn from this high major players' leadership role and their collaboration?
Well, sure, and thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this important issue. And I use the term glimmer of hope, very judiciously, because this, even though the US and China did end up cooperating during MC12, it's not like that means that the two largest economies in the world now have turned a corner and we're on the road to cooperation. But that said, I think one of the quiet stories of the ministerial was the fact that US and China privately got together and worked out some differences, particularly, and this is what I highlight in my piece, on the TRIPS waiver. And with respect to the TRIPS waiver, there were so many, sticky issues that were preventing agreement, particularly between India, South Africa, the US, and the EU. And once those four parties kind of came together with a compromise solution, one of the outstanding issues that wasn't resolved until the end was a difference of view between the United States and China about whether this waiver should apply to China or not. And China, in May at a General Council meeting, just announced that it was not going to avail itself to this waiver, which was a huge step forward, I thought, and paved the way for agreement with the United States. However, the United States, with the trust level so low between the two countries, insisted that an oral statement in a WTO meeting was insufficient. They needed something in writing that committed China to this exception, for not taking the exception. And again, it's something China said, well, we're not going to put that in writing. We can say that at a meeting. And so in a footnote 1 of the TRIPS waiver coming out of MC12, there are a few sentences there. And basically, this was an agreement where the US and China cobbled together, which basically allowed both sides to save face and to show that they got what they needed. The United States got a binding commitment and China never to put anything in writing. So it was very creative. And I think it suggested that when push comes to shove, when there are common interests, that the two sides can find a way to work together.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Wendy. And I think the footnote 1 exactly probably elaborates how a future way forward on the thorny issues such as development, special and differential treatment for developed countries, especially for big ones like China.
And I think that's important. Like it doesn't need necessarily, it could pave the way for future agreements and ways to kind of opt out of using the developing country status for ongoing and future negotiations. So it doesn't need, who knows, maybe this kind of solution can apply in future negotiations.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think that's probably explains how we could apply into different negotiations, adapting the new, more innovative methodology into that, so as to for each and every subject in the future. But other things which I have heard on my side, that not only on TRIPS waiver footnote 1, but also I heard that US-China also work together actually on the paragraph 3 of the outcome document, which talks about the reform on the dispute settlement mechanism as well as appellate body. And also they have also sat down together and agreed to on fisheries subsidies agreement to put aside for the moment the issue of forced labor, so on and so forth. So there are quite some things they have worked together. But also, you say that it doesn't mean that the two will turn around the corner and see eye to eye immediately. And in your paper, you also mentioned that deep divisions persist on many things on both sides. So what do you think? And also, the other thing is that MC12 is a kind of a moderate level of ambition with a lot of things putting aside for future negotiation. So putting all this together, what do you think are going to be the challenges for the post-MC12 work, especially the major players and how they could collaborate together? Yeah.
So I think the major challenges will be implementing the MC12 outcomes and ensuring that not only the big players implement the outcomes, but the small players do as well. But working on the reform agenda is going to be a huge task for WTO members. And, let's be honest, they didn't get a lot of guidance out of the MC12 document except to work on reform. I'm sure behind the scenes, there was a lot of detailed language that countries put forward to get more guidance. But at the end of the day, they agreed to lowest common denominator with everyone just saying, yeah, let's do reform. I think with everyone having different views on what that actually means in practice. So those are going to be the big challenges. But with respect to US and China, I think the big challenge in the WTO is the view of the United States and others that China is benefiting from the rules of the WTO. And yet, when it comes to Chinese practices based on a state-led model with state-owned enterprises, a lot of industrial subsidies and financial assistance, that those non-market economy practices are not sufficiently disciplined in the WTO. So, concern that China is getting the benefits, but not pay a lot because its practices aren't subject to rules. And until that tension is solved in the WTO, I fear that the WTO itself become increasingly irrelevant, despite the MC12 outcomes. And it's just going to lead to continued friction between the United States and China, as well as other countries in the WTO. It's an area that needs urgent attention.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I think that US-China have been talking to each other, not only bilaterally, but multilaterally. From the US side, they mentioned all these things about what you have said about the so-called non-market economy policies and practices, and also the developing country status, special and differential treatment, social and labor issues, so on and so forth. Of course, on the Chinese side, they have also been criticized in the US on unilateralism, protectionism, particularly on the Trump administration, and also this kind of recent what China calls a kind of value or ideology-driven anti-China alliance and agriculture subsidies. So there are too many things on the place of both sides. So they need to look at each other so as to make sure that things would happen in the future on both sides. But the other thing, which you also mentioned very importantly about post M12, not only the big ones, but also small ones need to implement what they agreed, but also need to work together for the way forward. And we do know that this WTO reform agenda and a lot of things left after M12 will need a lot of leadership role, not only from the major ones, China, US, but also EU and India and others, but also smaller ones whose engagement would also be essential. I mean, I heard during MC12 that the ASPI countries came into the negotiation at the last minute because they didn't like the low ambition of fisheries subsidies agreement, and they put this nicely sunset clause, Article 12 there, just to make sure that members will be incentivized to continue negotiation, and formulate more comprehensive disciplines on fisheries subsidies. So those what do you think that needs to happen post MC12? What structure do we need to put into place to make sure that we have leadership role from major players, but also active engagement from smaller ones? They worked all together, 164. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is for folks in Geneva not to become complacent and just think, yay, we got a victory out of MC12. We put the WTO back on the map. I mean, they have, and the WTO, if you think of, you think had there been no outcome, you could read the headlines, the WTO, is dead. So the WTO is alive. The MC12 outcomes are important, but again, put in a larger perspective, they're pretty minimal, and I don't discount the efforts by 164 countries to agree on anything. As a former trade negotiator, I know how tough all of these agreements must have been to reach. But given everything the global trading system is facing today, some of these outcomes are somewhat minimal. Some of them, let's be honest, with respect to response to pandemic, response to the food crisis, they're basically voluntary. They're not binding commitments. And so it's going to be very important for WTO members to keep the pressure on each other to ensure that, those important markets for medicines and for food stay open. In addition, the fisheries agreement, it doesn't come into force until 2/3 of the membership ratify the agreement. I mean, this could be years away, and then the next negotiation 4 years after that. So I don't mean to discount the outcomes, but I think what's important is that the WTO members and the folks in capital, they use the momentum of MC12 to try and not only to implement what they agreed on, but also to start tackling some of the more, fundamental and structural issues, as well as new issues surrounding climate and technology.
Yeah, what you said concurs a lot with me and many other of our members. Also, is that the next stage, kind of a good faith implementation of MC12 would be extremely important, especially those which, as you said, are more voluntary obligations. I mean, we have learned a lot from past history of multilateral negotiations. Quite some even voluntary ones were faithfully implemented, but some others do remain on the paper. So we have to make sure that those voluntary will become faithfully implemented. But also the other thing is that WTO reform, as you said in the very beginning, is a kind of huge agenda for the members ahead, and a lot of things needs to be done. It's just a process launch with a mandate and with some basic objectives. but it doesn't mean anything that we are not even probably starting to run yet about of this marathon. It's just the whistle has been blown. So, and Fish, you're also right that the first thing is to pass the outcome in domestic legislation. The thing is that we have seen that it ranges from 4 years to 40 years to pass some agreements we have done in the past. So all these things put together, it means a lot that we do need to carefully implement what has been agreed, but also to prepare for kind of long marathon ahead after MC12. And that's where we need a lot of leadership role from major ones, and also especially US, China, and also the engagement from all other members. So putting all this together, Wendy, what do you think would be your last message? I mean, to WTO members, especially the major ones such as US, China, and for the work more forward-looking after MC12, and what do you expect from them so as to make sure that what we are expecting them to do will happen and we'll have a better WTO and multilateral trading system. Wendy, please.
So really two messages. One would be, avoid complacency. Just because MC12 was successful doesn't mean the WTO is necessarily out of the woods. It has a lot on its plate, and for its continued relevance and credibility, it needs to continue producing meaningful outcomes. But second, I would hope that given the ability of ministers to work together and focus on WTO issues, that they have a renewed interest in capitals on the WTO, and maybe they have more confidence that the WTO can produce some results. And so maybe this will lead to momentum, not only in Geneva, but future engagement of key ministers, all around the world in the WTO. And that's something we really haven't seen, in recent years, because for a lot of ministers, there's so much on their plate between bilateral agreements and regional agreements and sectoral agreements and regional sectoral agreements that I assume when they get together, when they talk about the WTO, they just say, yes, we need to reform it. We need outcomes. The WTO is in crisis, etc. Now, hopefully, now that they've contributed to some success in the WTO, maybe this will, give them more ownership, and I think maybe more optimism about the ability of the WTO to produce meaningful results.
Thank you, Wendy. I think, firstly, the complacency would be the last thing we want from them. It's really a small plate they have done at MC12, and we need more and more big plates to come from them for the future of this, for us and others as stakeholders of this system. And also, I like what you said very much about the minister now refocusing, working together, and with more confidence and from capitals about the system, and also which could produce a new momentum, and also they need to engage each other, so on and so forth. On that, Brazil has tabled an interesting proposal during MC12 for kind of annual ministerial conference, so the ministers could see each other more, engage more constructively, build up a kind of chemistry and mutual confidence. Of course, we know that Paris, Davos, they have also other opportunities to meet. They should probably not only talking about bilateral and regional, but also the multilateral agenda ahead for them. I think that would be extremely important for the system, for the members, and for stakeholders like us. So with that,
exactly. But some of these kind of, and some of the mini ministerials you've referred to, I mean, my understanding is over the years, more countries are just sending their Geneva ambassadors, and the ministers haven't been as engaged. So, I would hope that, again, coming out of the MC12, that we'll see more ministerial engagement. And, I think the Director General can play a really important role here in traveling the world and getting ministers to keep their attention on the WTO.
Yeah, no, DG has been doing a lot on that, and really sometimes pushing the minister, as some ministers say that she has been pushing them when it is needed for them to sit down and together and asking them to table really kind of a meaningful text for the final agreement. So I think that's a very good thing from her, but also, as you said, ministers, instead of sending the ambassador, should sit together themselves and meeting, talking, and that's the only way for them to understand each other. So with that, I think that's a very nice message to the ministers, to the members, and also to the stakeholders that we expect more to come from them post MC12. Thank you very much, Wendy, for being with us, and we look forward to next time to engage you and for other panel discussions. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thank you.